This is the wooden Jesus that was behind me last time. I know one of you asked, and now you know. I don't remember who it was, but there he is. Alright, so chapter 13. For chapter 13 of Luke. Alright, I just want you to look at the first 9 verses, and I want you to answer a few questions. I'm going to try to set them up, and I'm going to try to not go into them so that we can talk about them. So Jesus talks about, in these verses, he's addressing the relationship of suffering and sin. Why would they go together? Have you ever heard anyone think that God makes sure people get what they deserve? Have you ever heard it goes around, comes around? Yeah, I've heard it plenty of times. I've heard it come out of Christians' mouths. Well, this is the question that came to Jesus. So they had heard here at the beginning about these people who had come to Jerusalem from Galilee, where Jesus was from, to this big city for worship, and Pilate killed them while they were worshiping, which is a very, very grave offense. I mean, like, to go basically like run into the temple in a very special worship service and kill people, pretty low blow. And the disciples want to know, when Pilate killed these people, is he doing it because those people happen to be super sinners? Like, think of it this way. Oh, those people got killed when they came to church. It's probably because they came into church, as they're really sinful, and so God struck them down, or got Pilate to go strike them down. Okay, so that first scene, it's humans getting other humans, but these horrible acts of violence happen because they're sinners and they deserved it. And Jesus says, no. Second scene. He says, well, speaking of what's been going on today, if you want to bring up the one in the temple, well, let's talk about these rocks that fell and killed 18 people off a building. Do you think that those 18 people were the worst sinners in Jerusalem and they just happened to die because God was trying to get even with people? And he says, of course not. Think about those two things. Think about how we speak as Christians then when people are doing things that are wrong, or when we do things that are wrong, or the other way, when suffering happens to us that is natural, like rocks falling off or sickness and all those things. Do we think either someone has it or we have it because God's trying to get back at us? Or do we think when something bad happens, God just wanted to make me get right with him, or force me to straighten out or think through things, that kind of thing? That's not how Jesus is wanting to frame this debate. And in fact, he takes those questions and says, let's think about this in a completely different way. So let's skip to the parable he tells following this in verses 6 through 9. He said, a man has a fig tree planted in his vineyard. One day he comes out looking for fruit on it, but there are no figs. He says to the vineyard keeper, look at this tree, for 3 years I've been hoping to come out here and find some fresh figs. Well, what do I find? Nothing. So I just go ahead and cut it down. Why waste the space with a fruitless fruit tree? The vineyard keeper replies, oh, give it another chance, sir. Give me 1 more year of working with it. I'll cultivate the soil, heap some manure on it to fertilize it. If it surprises us and bears fruit next year, that'll be great, but if not, then we'll cut it down. And so, why tell this parable following those two stories that says that this man who owns a vineyard is wanting fruit to come from his fruit tree, and he's going to get rid of it because his fruit tree isn't getting fruit to him? And he wants to know. And so the guy working the vineyard tells him, come on, give me 1 more year. I'll work with it good. I'll give it fertilizer. It'll go through all the seasons again. This year we'll do all we can do to make sure that this fruit tree does what is normal for a fruit tree to do. Fruit trees bear fruit. And we know that Jesus, when he uses these agricultural metaphors, fruit, he's talking about us as disciples bearing fruit. What kind of fruit do disciples bear? Go look it up. We've already been making a list. I'm not even going to tell you, but we bear fruit of love, generosity, all those kinds of things. And so these stories about God getting even and matching sin and suffering and things, he says, let me tell you a story. I want to know if a fruit tree bears fruit. So he takes these questions people are wanting to ask, where God's trying to get even, and turns it upside down and says, let's talk about what God wants. God wants a fruit tree to bear fruit. That's normal for a fruit tree to do. God wants a fruit tree to bear fruit. God wants a disciple to be a disciple. It's not a magical thing. And it doesn't say that he wants the fruit tree to be the greatest fruit tree of all time and feed every person in the whole world. He just wants it to bear fruit. And I think that's important, that if you're in a world where you think God's always trying to get even at you because you're sinning, and God's keeping a scale trying to even it out, you could get really worried and be worried, oh, have I done too many bad things today that maybe a rock's going to fall on me and hit in the head? Or, oh no, someone close to me is really sick. Is that happening because God's wanting to get even at them for something bad they've done? You could ask all those questions. And Jesus, I think, actually frees us right here. He tells a story and says, no, don't do that. I don't want to keep the keeping level scales game. I want fruit trees to bear fruit. That's exciting, I think, because it says to us, hey, disciples, I just want you to be disciples. I don't want you to be anything magical. I don't want you to be a fruit tree that bears loaves of bread. Or I don't want you to be a disciple that, does something unnatural to who you are. God wants you to be fully you. And God wants you to bear the fruit that God's made you to bear. Maybe you're an apple disciple. Maybe you're an orange disciple. Or maybe whatever it is. But you don't need to be sitting around anxious and scared and fearful of God for doing the wrong thing. God wants you to do exactly what you want to do. It's not magical. Or not what you want to do, but what God wants you to do. That kind of thing. Does that make sense? Good. God wants you to be a disciple, the kind of disciple God's already made you to be, and go on that journey. It's not magical. You don't need to fear it. You just need to make fruit. Now, those crazy verses that, if you're thinking in the whole wrong framework, could freak you out. Like this. But listen, if you do not consider God's ways and truly change, then friends, you should prepare to face his judgment and eternal death. Now, if you're thinking of the get even God, scary. But if you're thinking about bearing the right type of fruit, nothing magical, but something natural that's part of a normal process of transformation, then Jesus is saying, don't do the sin and guilt game. Do this. Friends. Did you hear the word? Friends. Consider God's ways, God's life-giving and loving ways, and then be transformed. Just like that tree wasn't bearing fruit, let the manure get in your roots. Take in the water and just do what you naturally do. If you don't, you will face judgment, because fruit trees that don't bear fruit get cut down. But it's not asking you to a miracle to happen. It's just asking you to do what God wants you to do. And God's doing all that God can to do it. And so you don't have to become Jesus. You just have to become who God's making you to be. It's not something you have to be scared of unless you're unwilling to just be who you are. An apple tree or whatever. And the second thing is really important there. It's about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I just want to remind you, you don't really have to write about this, but Jerusalem does get destroyed because the people there chose the way of violence, and they didn't win in interacting with the Roman government. And Jesus has called us to the way of peacemaking. And so I think that's a real practical example of the very thing we're saying. If you follow Jesus' ways, you take the way of peacemaking, not the way of the sword. And so I hope that helps, and I'm looking forward to your reflection.